This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com. David Hume was an amiable fellow, nicknamed Le Bon David by his friends in France. But in 18th century Scotland, his contentious views on religion were enough to block an academic career and force him to earn his living from essays and books. On his deathbed, his friend James Boswell was aghast that Hume still wouldn't concede the possibility of an afterlife. Hume's best-known work on religion, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, was published only posthumously. Among the issues Hume addressed was the argument from design, the claim that the best explanation for the wonder and order of the world is that it's the work of a supreme being. A dog's paws seem perfectly designed for walking, his tail for wagging, his snout for sniffing. Surely this is evidence, if not proof, for the existence of God. Hume attempted to bury the argument from design once and for all. Stuart Sutherland is a Hume scholar who sits in the House of Lords and is provost of Gresham College.
Stuart Sutherland, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here with you.
Now, the topic we want to discuss today is David Hume, the great 18th century philosopher, but particularly his ideas about the argument from design. But before we do that, perhaps you could say a little bit about who David Hume was.
David Hume, to my mind, was the greatest of philosophers who has lived and worked on these islands. And the fact that he was a Scot doesn't make me biased. The fact that I live 4 miles from where he was born perhaps does. That's in the borders in Berwickshire in Scotland. But he wrote works that set the pattern for the development of empirical philosophy. Coming after Locke, he pushed it much further forward, and then a great tradition in England especially followed that. John Stuart Mill, Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, and so on. And Hume was the man who defined that tradition.
Many of the people that you just mentioned in that sentence, Ayer, Bertrand Russell, are renowned as atheists. Hume was known as the great infidel. Was he really an atheist?
Great argument over this, and in fact his seminal work on this, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, was published only after he died, and he left it to his good friend Adam Smith to do this. There was great argument about which character was Hume in these dialogues. In the end, I think Hume was agnostic, and as you say these days, some of his best friends were clerics. Even so, he had a very strong anti-clerical line, but on the other hand, if people wanted to go off in a corner and believe religious things, that was fine. What he didn't want was that religion should have any impact on moral, political and legal judgments. And if you separate the two out, Hume would be content.
But he was also concerned, when reason was being used, that it was being used well. And in the area of the argument from design, many people were arguing to a conclusion that he thought didn't follow from the premises.
Absolutely so. Hume insisted that if you were to be reasonable and if you were to base your arguments on empirical experience, which of course was his starting point always, if that was so, you had to follow the argument where it went. And he didn't believe that the traditional argument from design worked. In other words, it didn't take you to belief in God.
So what was the argument from design?
Well, the argument from design is basically the argument that within the empirical world, you can see traces of intelligent design, and that this design therefore indicates that the empirical world in which we live had a designer. And that designer, of course, the Christians associate with the traditional belief in a creator God. And so they wanted to argue from examples of design in the empirical world to a creator God who had designed all of this.
So, for example, the human eye is a brilliant device for allowing us to see the world. And the argument is it couldn't have just arisen by chance.
Absolutely so. And Hume would accept that people used all sorts of instances in nature, provided they were living and organic. He didn't tend to follow the inorganic world in quite the same way, but living entities, all according to his opponent, showed examples of design.
So what's wrong with that?
What's wrong with that was Hume said, well, for a start, it produces an infinite regress. You look at the world and you see in the world what you think are causal factors that show elements of design. But as he then pointed out, behind that there must surely be another cause, and how far back do you go? So his first counter-argument was an ad infinitum argument.
But a Christian's got an easy answer to that. They can say, well, look, we go just as far back as God the Creator.
Yes, and Hume said, well, actually, hold on a minute. No, you don't. Because what you find is, if you argue in this way from the empirical world, you will see that the argument presumes that there's a very close analogy between the mind of God and the mind of human beings. And so you look at the world and you look at, for example, a clock, and you think behind the example of the clock there is a clockmaker or designer of the clock. The argument then is that that has an analogy to the relationship between the world and the Christian God. Hume was quite devastating on this, and if you want to look it up, it's section 5 of the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. In that, he led, through one of his characters, the natural theologian, Cleanthes, down a road. And he said to Cleanthes, now, let's think about this. Philo the skeptic says this to Cleanthes. If you assume that behind nature there's a mind, a bit like the human mind behind a designed clock, is that what you're claiming? I said, oh, yes, that's exactly what I'm claiming. And Hume said, well, the liker the better, the mind and the designer of the clock. And Cleanthes said, oh, yeah, absolutely. The closer the analogy, the stronger the argument. And what Philo then points out is that means that the strongest argument produces not a Christian God, but something akin to a weak, fallible human being, like a clockmaker. The liker, the better. Cleanthes signs up to that, and Hume says, in that case, you don't have an infinite God, you have the equivalent of a limited, finite human mind.
He's got some other great arguments, hasn't he? I mean, he says things like, if we look at the elaborate constructions that human beings have made, they're usually made by teams of people, not by individuals.
Yes, he points out that, of course, if you really argued in this way, you could come up with polymorphism. In any building, there's not one individual at work. There are teams, there are architects, there are engineers, there are builders, there are stonemasons, and so on. Is it like that in the world, which is an immensely complicated entity?
Or equally, it could be the work of a god who'd subsequently died.
Well, that's a possibility as well. It might have been over many generations that this took place, and over many generations, people come and go, and they pass on and leave their legacy behind them.
Or it could be the work of a feeble god. Given that there are certain imperfections visible in human beings, for instance, take the eye, it's prone to short-sightedness, cataracts, all kinds of problems associated with it. How is that the work of an infinite, benevolent God?
Well, I've discovered the more aged I get, the more likely that there will be flaws in the way in which my body operates and interacts with the world. Hume would point this out. A world in which there are failures, and there are failures in this world, a world in which there is suffering, and let's move on to that separately in a moment. But in such a world, you have a picture of a God who is less than infinite.
So let's take that question of suffering. What has Hume got to say about the obvious existence of pain in the world?
Hume's argument here is classic. He asks his opponents in arguments to say whether or not God is supposed to be infinite, whether God is supposed to be omniscient, whether God is supposed to be omnipotent. And, as Hume puts it, well, if God is all of these things, and if nonetheless you still have suffering in the world, you have a major problem. Either he doesn't know that there is suffering, in which case he is not omniscient, or he is not able to do anything about it, in which case he is not omnipotent. Or perhaps neither of these, he simply doesn't love his creatures, which of course would be wholly against the Christian message.
So do you think that Hume showed that God doesn't exist?
I think what Hume has shown is that the God taught by traditional Christianity does not exist. I think, however, he was willing to allow that if people have some other account they wish to give of God, that's up to them, but it won't be the God of the clerics, and it won't be the gods of the traditional theistic belief.
So should we rely on faith?
Well, again, Hume wanted to contrast a belief that was based on absence of rational argument, which might produce a mysterious God, and say, well, so you've got us a mysterious God, what can you deduce from that? Nothing. And you certainly cannot deduce rules for living.
In lots of other areas of his philosophy, Hume's resort was to say that reason is the slave to passions, that there are natural aspects of human beings that ultimately determine how we experience the world. Couldn't it be the same with a tendency to believe in God?
Well, he does accept that people do have such a tendency, that there are powerful emotions at work here, and he does accept that people do not wish to feel constrained by their own limitations and might well wish to go beyond these or hope that there's some means of going beyond these. But nonetheless, if you have such passions, if you have such emotions, because that's how he was using the word passions, if you have such emotions, again, what follows from them? Nothing about the way we should or might want to live.
Do you think that Hume's writings on religion are relevant to us now?
Yeah, I think they're relevant in two very specific ways. One was he was a very tolerant man. Some of his best friends were clergymen, and he would be happily out to dinner with them, do arguing with them, jesting with them. But on the other hand, if he came across what he regarded as priestliness, or the cult of the priest, or the cleric, or clerisy as he called it, he could be quite devastating in his criticisms. And what he meant by that was the attempt to use non-rational sources to impose systems of belief, systems of ethics, systems of politics, and systems of law on non-believers. And his critique there, I think, is very relevant to today.
Stuart Sutherland, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com. As David Hume lay dying, he infuriated a friend by refusing to seek consolation in the promise of an afterlife. Hume, a Scot, is now generally recognised as the greatest English-speaking philosopher to date. Philosophers still grapple with his ideas on causation, on induction, on morality. Whether he was an atheist or merely an agnostic is debatable. Peter Millikan, a Hume specialist, believes that he occasionally toned down his critique of religion for reasons of self-preservation, and so as not to alienate his friends. His views on religion, Millikan argues, fit into a wider critique of human reason, and it's in what Hume says about the limits of reason that his real significance lies.
Peter Millikan, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
The topic we're focusing on is the significance of David Hume. For many people, he is the great philosopher. I wonder if you could say a bit about who he was and why his work is so significant.
Well, David Hume was one of the great philosophers of the early modern period, the 17th and 18th centuries. He's standardly thought of as one of the big three British empiricists, along with Locke and Berkeley. But I think Hume has a significance greater than that. There's a sense in which he stands apart from all of the philosophers of the period as the first really modern thinker who developed a view of human reason which belongs far more naturally with Darwin than with Descartes or Aristotle or any of the previous thinkers.
So what did come before Hume? What was he reacting against?
Well, to understand that, I think it's useful to think of the whole period. So what you had in the early modern period was a reaction against the medieval world, and that was largely building by that stage on Aristotle. Aristotle's theory of the world was based on the idea that everything about the world is fundamentally intelligible. You can understand the way that things work in the world in terms of purposes, not only God's purposes, but purposes within things as well. So if you ask, why does a stone, when you let it go, fall to the ground? It's because it strives to reach the centre of the universe. Why do heavenly bodies move in circles? Well, they strive to move in circles to get nearer to the divine perfection and so forth. Now, what happened in the early modern period as science developed, and in particular the theory of the heavens that was associated with Aristotle, got overthrown? Galileo, a major figure there. That became displaced by a view of the world based on mechanical science. People like Galileo and Descartes developed a view of the world quite different from Aristotle's. Instead of seeing the way things behaved as being determined by purposes, strivings, instead you got a paradigm of nature being fundamentally causal and mechanical causal. Why does one thing happen? Well, because it is caused to happen by something else bashing into it or pushing it or whatever. Now, that was taken further in Britain by people like Robert Boyle, John Locke, Isaac Newton, of course, major figure. They saw this as a huge advance on Aristotle because instead of having, as it were, occult interactions between things, this mysterious idea that matter might strive to reach a certain position or anything like that, instead, nature becomes intelligible.
So where does Hume come in here?
Well, what Hume did was to take this notion of intelligibility and say, actually, guys, you don't really understand in this sense why anything works as it does. At the time, people used to point to things like gravity and say, oh, gravity is a real problem. How do we explain how things can attract each other? Mechanical causation, billiard balls, that's fine. Gravity, a real problem. How can a planet be attracted to the sun? It would have to know where the sun was in order to move in the direction of the sun. So people saw that as a puzzle. Now, what Hume did was to say, no, actually, the same kind of puzzle that you have about that, you ought to have even about the interaction of billiard balls. When one billiard ball bashes into another, you think you understand why it causes the other one to move. You think it's intelligible, but really it isn't.
OK, let's take that example of billiard balls colliding. I hit the white one, it hits the red one moves. The motion is somehow transferred from one to the other. I can see the cause of the effect.
It is very hard to pull yourself away from this natural way of looking at things. Now, Hume has a lovely thought experiment for making this clear. He asks us to imagine Adam, the first man, created by God with perfect human intellectual faculties. He's got perfect sight, his eyes work well, etc. And Hume says, right, imagine God's just created Adam, and in front of Adam he sees one billiard ball moving towards another. And God says to him, well, Adam, what do you think's going to happen when that ball reaches the other one? Imagine how could Adam even start to work out what was going to happen. Maybe the ball will stop, maybe the second one will move, maybe the first one will bounce off it in some direction, maybe the second one will turn into a frog. How does he know, without prior experience to call on, what's going to happen when the two balls collide? He can't. And the message is, whenever we make an inference like that about what's going to happen, we are always drawing on past experience. And then the question is, what right do we have to do that?
What right do we have to do that? It seems quite reasonable to think about what's happened in the past and assume it will carry on going along similar lines in the future.
Hume actually wouldn't deny that in a sense it's perfectly reasonable. But the point he wants to focus on is this. We have no insight into the nature of things that leads us to make that supposition. It's a very natural supposition to make. We do naturally take for granted that what's happened in the past will broadly continue into the future. But again, Hume has a very nice argument. He says, OK, what ground could we give for extrapolating from past to future? It's not self-evident. You can coherently imagine it not continuing in the future in the same way. You can't give any sort of deductive proof that it will continue, because again, it's perfectly coherent that it shouldn't continue. Nothing that you sense about objects, I mean, when you perceive the billiard ball, nothing that you learn directly through your senses tells you about how it will continue in the future, as we've seen in the case of Adam. So what other recourse do we have? Well, the only other recourse is an appeal to experience. But that's what we're trying to justify. So, in fact, when you try to produce any justification, any argument, any reason for extrapolating from past to future, you can't.
So you're saying, for Hume, trying to justify the idea that the future will be like the past by saying the future has always been like the past in the past is almost like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not a satisfactory way of justifying what's known as induction.
Exactly. That sort of justification would only work if you're already persuaded that induction is a rational method of inference.
And presumably Hume is going to say that we are just relying on some kind of natural tendency here to see the future carrying on in the same way given to us by experience.
Yes, that's right. And again, coming back to the fact that Hume doesn't actually want to say that it's wrong that we should do that, the point he's making is that when we do extrapolate in that way, we are relying on this brute animal instinct that leads us to expect the same in the future as we've experienced in the past. He's not saying we shouldn't do that, but let us be aware that it is just that. It is an assumption, an instinct. It's not founded on any kind of godlike insight into why things behave as they do.
And that idea that we have to see human beings as part of the animal kingdom in this respect must have been quite radical in the 18th century.
Very much so. We were talking about it earlier, how the mechanical view of the world became very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries. But man was always excluded. So you've got Descartes, for example, thinking of animals as just machines. But Descartes famously drew a very radical distinction between mind and matter. And a very common bogey in the 17th century was the materialist. I mean, Thomas Hobbes was the paradigm materialist who denied that there was an immaterial world. He said everything was material. And that was anathema in the 17th century. People were even criticised for denying the existence of witches and things like that, because it was very, very important to the worldview there that although the physical world could be understood causally and mechanically, there was this other world, this spiritual world, a world of reason, which is quite distinct from the physical world. And we partake in that.
Another important related aspect of Hume's work is his attack, I can't put it any other way, on some of the standard arguments for God's existence.
Yes, although for many years people actually thought of these as not being central, if you like, to Hume's philosophical mission, I think they're quite wrong. Hume wrote more on philosophy of religion than any other area of philosophy. In the early stuff, he tended towards self-censorship. He removed from the Treatise of Human Nature discussion of miracles, for example, and then in his later work in the Inquiry, that comes back. Now, it is actually in a way a bit puzzling that Hume takes this line, because many people think of Hume as an irrationalist, because as we've seen, he is sceptical about the pretensions of reason. But in fact, Hume is very pro-science, anti-superstition, and it's quite a delicate balance. We've seen that he reduces, as it were, scientific reasoning to an animal instinct, the instinct for expecting the future to resemble the past. But then he wants to advocate that and say, that's how we ought to reason about the world, because actually that's the only basis that we have for learning anything about the world.
So how does that apply to arguments about God's existence?
Well, perhaps the clearest example, and it's a very beautiful example, is the discussion of miracles in Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Imagine that you're a religious believer who founds your belief on stories of miracles. OK, so you come along and you say, so-and-so told me a miracle happened, and I believe it. And what Hume does is to say, well, hang on a minute, why do you believe what they say? And the answer has to be, you believe what so-and-so says because they tend to tell the truth. So Hume points out here that you yourself are relying on induction. You yourself are relying on the assumption that because they've generally told the truth in the past, that's good reason for supposing that they will tell the truth in the future. But then in that case, you ought to be consistent. If you're going to use induction as your basis for belief, then you ought to apply induction also to your understanding of how things behave. And you've never experienced, let's say, a statue crying. So if this person told you that they saw a statue crying, you've got a kind of conflict. On the one hand, you've got inductive evidence that they tend to tell the truth, which tells in favour of the statue crying. On the other hand, you've got your own experience of statues, which tells you they don't cry. So the religious believer ends up in a sort of conflict between two inductive arguments. And what Hume says is the argument based on the uniformity of nature about the statue will always beat the other one, because we know from experience that people do make mistakes, people are subject to illusion, people also lie.
So is there any place for God in Hume's account of the world?
No, Hume is, to all intents and purposes, an atheist.
That's interesting, because a lot of people have read his work closely and think of him not as an atheist, but as a very sceptical agnostic.
Hume is quite difficult to pin down on the question of God's existence, and it's entirely understandable given the time in which he wrote. You could actually be prosecuted for infidelity at the time, and it certainly would have alienated a lot of his friends if he'd come out explicitly as an atheist. So it requires some reading between the lines of Hume's texts. He tends, for example, to write essays in which the first and the last paragraph imply that he's a believer, but then when you look at all the arguments in between, they point in the opposite direction. This was actually a very common phenomenon at the time. It's been called theological lying.
So to sum up, Hume's significance is that he attacked the idea that we have this faculty of reason that allows the world to be intelligible to us in a transparent way, and also that he removed God from the picture.
Yes, that's right. And these are, in a way, two sides of the same coin. Prior to Hume, people thought of the world as designed by a divine intelligence and saw our intelligence, our minds, as given by God so as to enable us to understand the intricacy of his creation. So the two somewhat go together. What Hume does, he takes out the divine creator, says, no, actually we've got no reason to suppose that the world was created by a perfect being. And he also, perhaps inevitably, displaces us so that we are no longer to think of our reason as being some faint copy of a divine faculty, and instead to see it as an augmented and very powerful instance of an animal faculty.
Peter Milliken,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
And you can hear more Philosophy Bites at www.philosophybites.com.